Hi, and welcome to International Christian Fellowship of Lublin and our Resurrection Day Easter Sunday sermon for 2021. Looking back on this last year, one of the things that comes to mind is how many conspiracy theories we've been hearing over the past year, year and a half. Suppose go back a couple of years and you have the theories about the 5G towers being put up everywhere and how they were frying our brains or something like that. But then, when you had the coronavirus start, of course, first of all, there were theories that no, it really wasn't a risk. That there was really no such thing as this coronavirus. I remember a long conversation with a friend of mine here in Poland who then went back to the States for a while, how it wasn't really a true risk. Then, as it became more prevalent, people were saying, well, it was something that was invented by the Chinese as a way to take over the world. It was made artificially in a lab. Then, it was just a political tool. This was all political for political gain by whoever, whichever country you happen to be from. It was either the U.S. Coming up with it, and the Democrats in an attempt to attack President Trump, or somehow, here in Europe, etc. Of course, one key figure in many of the conspiracy theories is Bill Gates, as this supposedly evil genius has thought up both the virus and then later the vaccines as a way to control us. And the vaccines are another conspiracy theory, of course, that they have a chip in them or they're the mark of the beast or something like that. And it's all, once again, it's Bill Gates trying to take over the world or some evil plot by whoever. You know what I mean. That's we've heard so many of these theories the last year or so. And then if you're American or have watched the American elections, there were tons of conspiracy theories connected with the election and trying to explain different numbers and how President Trump lost the election, how current President Biden won the election. And that's not necessarily anything new. If you go back to the 2016 elections, there were also those who didn't want President Trump to win, who called it conspiracy by the Russians that gave him the victory. So, unfortunately, I suppose we have become fairly. It's been a common thing for us in our day and age to have all these conspiracy theories that float around, and unfortunately, some of us then spend time even sharing some of them. But I want to go back to one of the early conspiracy theories that we actually find in the Bible at the very end of the Gospels, and it's connected with the resurrection, with the first Easter. So I'm going to read Matthew chapter 28, verses 1 through 15. And notice as I get to the last few verses, this conspiracy theory that is developed not as a way to explain the resurrection, but actually as a way to give people some other possible explanation that takes them away from the truth of the resurrection. So, Matthew chapter 28, verses 1 through 15. Early on Sunday morning, as the new day was dawning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went out to visit the tomb. Suddenly there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, rolled aside the stone, and sat on it. His face shone like lightning, and his clothing was as white as snow. The guards shook with fear when they saw him, and they fell into a dead faint. Then the angel spoke to the women. "Don't be afraid," he said. "I know you are looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He isn't here. He has risen from the dead, just as he said would happen. Come, see where his body was lying. And now, go quickly and tell his disciples that he has risen from the dead, and he is going ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there. Remember what I have told you." The women ran quickly from the tomb. They were very frightened, but also filled with great joy, and they rushed to give the disciples the angel's message. And as they went, Jesus met them and greeted them. And they ran to him, grasped his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Don't be afraid. Go, tell my brothers to leave for Galilee, and they will see me there." As the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and told the leading priests what had happened. A meeting with the elders was called, and they decided to give the soldiers a large bribe. They told the soldiers, "You must say, 'Jesus' disciples came during the night while we were sleeping, and they stole his body.' If the governor hears about it, We'll stand up for you so you don't get in trouble." So the guards accepted the bribe and said what they were told to say. Their story spread widely among the Jews, and they still tell it today. So, did you notice that conspiracy there, the beginnings of this conspiracy? As, first of all, the elders give the soldiers a bribe, and they give them the bribe so that they will say that Jesus' disciples stole the body, and all of this is in order for them not to get in trouble with the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. And then, verse 15, their story spread widely among the Jews, and they still tell it today. Now, of course, that doesn't mean today in 2021. That means today, as Matthew was writing his gospel, all 20 or years, 20, 30 years after the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But why? Why did the chief priests come up with this conspiracy theory? Why did they bribe the soldiers to say this? And then perhaps why even did people believe it? Well, let's go back to what happened the day before. The day before the resurrection, after Jesus after Jesus died, was buried in the tomb. So we're looking back one chapter earlier, the very end of chapter 27, verses 62 through 66. The next day, this is the next day after Jesus' death, on the Sabbath, the leading priests and Pharisees went to see Pilate. They told him, "Sir, we remember what that deceiver once said while he was still alive. After 3 days, I will rise from the dead. So we request that you seal the tomb until the 3rd day. This will prevent his disciples from coming and stealing his body and then telling everyone he was raised from the dead. If that happens, we'll be worse off than we were at first." Pilate replied, "Take guards and secure it the best you can." So they sealed the tomb and posted guards to protect it. Now, I don't think that the chief priests actually believed that Jesus would rise from the dead. At the same time, I'm not sure that I really believe that they thought the disciples would come and steal the body either. But they were covering their tails no matter what happened. So they asked Pilate for the guard, they seal the tomb, and actually what this does is makes the miracle of the resurrection even greater. It gives actually more proof to the fact that this was a miraculous resurrection because there's the sealed tomb, there's the guards standing around it, standing guard through the night, and so it's miraculous. It's not possible that the disciples stole the body. It's not possible that anything happened other than what did happen. In other words, that Jesus rose from the dead, the angels opened the tomb, and Jesus walked forth. But the chief priests have come up with this idea based on something that Jesus said already. So let's go back to the 3 times that Jesus says something about his resurrection before his death. He does this in 3 times in Matthew. And so the first one is in chapter 16, verses 21 through 23. From then on, Jesus began to tell his disciples plainly that it was necessary for him to go to Jerusalem, that he would suffer many terrible things at the hands of the elders, the leading priests, and the teachers of religious law. He would be killed, but on the 3rd day he would be raised from the dead. But Peter took him aside and began to reprimand him for saying such things. "Heaven forbid, Lord," he said, "this will never happen to you." Jesus turned to Peter and said, "Get away from me, Satan. You are a dangerous trap to me. You are seeing things merely from a human point of view, not from God's." So this is the first time that Jesus, or first time we have recorded anyway in Matthew, that Jesus says that he is going to die and that he would rise from the dead in verse 21. Notice, however, that he tells his disciples this, and this is key in a second. So let's go to chapter 17 then, verses 22 and 23. The next time that Jesus says that he's going to be killed and rise from the dead. After they gathered, verses 22 and 23, after they gathered again in Galilee, Jesus told them, "The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of his enemies. He will be killed, but on the 3rd day he will be raised from the dead." And the disciples were filled with grief. Now, here we don't exactly know the extent of the group that Jesus is talking to, but once again, it looks like he's talking just to his 12 disciples. Then let's go on to Matthew chapter 20, verses 17 through 19. As Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside privately and told them what was going to happen to him. Listen, he said, we're going up to Jerusalem, where the Son of Man will be betrayed to the leading priests and the teachers of religious law. They will sentence him to die. Then they will hand him over to the Romans to be mocked, flogged with a whip, and crucified. But on the third day he will be raised from the dead. So these are the three times that Jesus says that he will be killed by the chief priests, but that he will be raised from the dead. All three times, though, it looks like he's talking just to the disciples. Now, I don't think that this was a secret, what Jesus was telling them. However, it does look like there's a leak among the disciples. Somebody let the chief priests, the scribes, the Pharisees, the teachers of the law know that Jesus had said this. Now, he did give this kind of clue once when he chased people out of the temple, that if they destroyed the temple, he would raise it up again in 3 days. But that I don't think anybody understood that to mean that he was talking about rising from the dead until well after his resurrection. The rest of the times where he clearly says anything about his resurrection coming, he says it just to the disciples. So, what are the priests trying to accomplish, both in chapter 27 when they set the guard, and then in 28 when they come up with this conspiracy theory? And why are they trying to accomplish this? So it seems obvious. The number one thing they're trying to accomplish is try to keep people from believing that this person actually rose from the dead. Now, the backstory of this, of course, is Lazarus, just a few miles away from Jerusalem, and not that long before, Jesus had raised Lazarus from the dead, and everybody in the area knew about it. This miraculous thing that had happened as Lazarus walked forth from the tomb. So they do not want anybody to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. They do not want people to follow Christ. Now, on the one hand, that's because, and it seems evident through the Gospels, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, are following a different master. They are not really following God. And Jesus accuses them of this frequently through the Gospels. But probably more realistically, it's because they are afraid for their own position. They're afraid for their own position as leaders of the people, of what the Romans might do when it comes to light that this miracle worker, this teacher, this person who's been proclaimed King of the Jews just that Sunday, on Palm Sunday, now has risen from the dead. And this is a good question then for each of us as we consider the resurrection. What keeps you from believing in the resurrection? Are you trusting some conspiracy theory to not believe in the resurrection? And there are many. There have been so many attempts throughout history to explain away the resurrection, starting with this very first one, which actually many people do still believe today, that the disciples stole the body. The problem is that theory is so unlikely and nearly impossible because of what the chief priests did in order to guard against that. As they set this guard of soldiers watching the tomb around the clock, sealing the tomb, made it impossible for this band of 11 scared individuals to do anything to get the body out of the tomb. Or another idea is that Jesus actually was he was just asleep. He was just unconscious there on the cross. He wasn't really dead. Well, proof of his death actually comes in the spear thrust into his side, where it hits his heart and both water and blood come out, a sign that he's clearly dead. And also, of course, with these experienced soldiers who take him down off the cross, yes, of course, it certainly was possible then to mistake somebody who wasn't dead as being actually dead. But these were soldiers who were fairly familiar with death. Or that it wasn't really Jesus who died. This is an odd theory since everyone, including his enemies, his closest friends, and his own mother, were convinced that it was Jesus who died there on that cross and Jesus who was put into the tomb. But the corollary with that is that another conspiracy theory, it wasn't really Jesus who rose from the dead. But again, the same problems. Again, it was both his enemies were convinced, his closest friends, his own mom, that this was really Jesus then who actually died and who actually was later walking around alive. Then there's the idea throughout, well, maybe it's a more recent idea, but that everybody who saw Jesus later was hallucinating. That one actually is probably the least possible of all. Of course, one person, two people maybe could have had the same hallucination, maybe even a handful of people, as we know the power of suggestion sometimes. But dozens? Hundreds? And those who actually doubted as well that he rose from the dead? That is impossible. The other idea is that this is just a made-up story. That the Gospels that talk about the resurrection, all of these were written well after the fact, and people who wanted to follow Jesus Christ just made up this story. Well, yes, that one's possible. It's possible they just made up the story. The difficulty, however, with that is they stuck to this story without exception. Yes, there were people who denied their faith hundreds of years later, but those who walked and talked with Jesus, who saw him before he died, who saw him after he rose from the dead, not one single member of that group ever once retracted the story that Jesus Christ had died and rose from the dead. And every single one of them, except for one, except for John, paid for that with their very lives. They were put to death when all they would have had to say was, yeah, you know what? We just made it up. So that's no one broke, and there was nothing in it for them. There was no power in it for them. In fact, the total opposite. So that one as well seems incredibly unlikely that this is a made-up story. They lost their lives over this story. So now let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where Paul actually talks a little bit about this and dealing with the hallucination part as well. Verses 1 through 9, Paul writes, "Now let me remind you, dear brothers and sisters, of the good news I preached to you before. You welcomed it then, and you still stand firm in it. It is this good news that saves you if you continue to believe the message I told you, unless, of course, you believed something that was never true in the first place. I passed on to you what was most important and what had also been passed on to me. Christ died for our sins, just as the Scripture said. He was buried, and he was raised from the dead on the third day, just as the Scriptures said. He was seen by Peter, and then by the 12. After that, he was seen by more than 500 of his followers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died, of course, still alive when Paul was writing 1 Corinthians 15. Then he was seen by James, and later by all the apostles. Last of all, as though I had been born at the wrong time, I also saw him. For I am the least of all the apostles. In fact, I'm not even worthy to be called an apostle after the way I persecuted God's church." And a quick reminder, Paul was an enemy of Jesus Christ, and yet he became convinced that everything that Jesus Christ said was true because he saw the resurrected Christ. But that's a lot of witnesses that Paul mentions. He has Peter, the 12, 500, James, all the apostles, Paul himself. We also know from the gospel stories that there's Mary. There's a group of women that Mary, his mother, that is. There's Mary Magdalene. There's a group of women as well that see him first. There's the 10 disciples minus Judas and Thomas. Then there's the 11, including Thomas. There's John along with Peter later. Um, there's John actually in the book of Revelation on Patmos as well. And we know too from the Gospels or the book of Acts actually that he ministered for 40 days after his resurrection. So there's probably way more witnesses than Paul lists or we even know about. 40 days is a long time. That's long enough for, first of all, if this was fake, for the Jewish leaders, for the Romans to uncover it, to figure it out, to kill him again, or finish killing him, as the case may be. But they couldn't. Why? Because it's no conspiracy theory. This is the truth. So the question then for you is, what are you doing with that truth? Yes, it's amazing, truly. It is, in a sense, unbelievable. It's incredible. We don't believe the resurrection because resurrections don't happen, right? It's one of a kind. That's the point, though. But believing in the resurrection can completely and totally change your life. In conclusion, one tiny little personal application. This is one of the reasons why, as Christians, we need to be really careful when we get involved in conspiracy theories. We already believe something that the world finds completely unbelievable. We believe in the resurrection of a person. We believe that God became human. We believe that believing in that can change your life. You can be born again. You can have a relationship with God based on faith in Jesus Christ. We already believe and preach some things that the world finds incredible. We need to be very careful not to lose our witness because we start to proclaim other things that actually are lies. Avoid those and focus on the truth of the resurrection, however incredible it sounds. Thanks for watching. See you guys next week.